As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
All right, well, welcome to another episode of Classical Etc., sitting with Ian, Kyle, and Martin. We've done a Russian literature episode before. Martin, you weren't on that one. We had Mitch because he loves Turgenev's Father and Sons. But we're doing an episode on American literature, so we wanted to bring in a noble American rather than a wretched one for this episode. And so we brought you in and left Mitch out. So nobody tell him I said that. However, before we get to the discussion of American literature, I think that actually a really good setup of the conversation will be the conversation we were just having before we sat down at the table in our, we have very extensive pre-production meetings where I ask you guys to do a lot of research and you guys you slave over it. And in that meeting, as we were arguing about it heatedly, someone brought up the legendary American film Shrek. And some were saying that it is worthwhile, and others were saying that it is abominable evil. Now, I think there's a tie-in to our topic of American literature, but Kyle, state the positions and tell me which one is wrong and which one is right.
So, if to the degree, my argument has been, The Ethics of Elfland, Chapter 4 of Chesterton's Orthodoxy, was originally proposed to me as, someone told me, Kyle, this is what you're always talking about. You should read this chapter. You'll love it. And it just so happens that same year I also had to teach it. So I read Orthodoxy and it was absolutely, I just ate everything. It was exactly what I wanted someone to say. And I feel that to the degree that one follows what Chesterton is saying and loves the truth of fairy tales and loves beauty as beautiful, and therefore despises evil as evil, to the degree that you love, that truth, you should hate or despise, we'll say, the work that subverts that truth and says that no, the evil thing, the ogre can be the good guy, and Prince Charming, the good guy, can be the bad guy and is actually evil and is attempting to turn everything upside down. This rubs me the wrong way.
Sure.
Yeah.
So to which I replied, is all subversion wrong? And Martin, you started to say, this ties to American literature. And then I was like, stop.
Yeah. Well, I was making the point that the literary mode of irony has become the dominant mode, particularly in our pop culture. So that you will have children of this generation reading The Three Little Pigs from the wolf's perspective before they've read The Three Little Pigs, and that this is not a good thing. Even to understand irony, because it is a subordinate mode necessarily, because you can't even understand what it's doing unless you understand the primary mode. So even to understand it, you need the primary mode, which is basically heroic in some way. So I was just my problem with Shrek is not that the good guy can become the bad guy. That happens in Zorro. One of the we're talking about American literature, Pulp Fiction, Johnston McCulley, the original Zorro story, which is epic and mythic, and he is it's the good guy. The bad guy turns out to be the good guy, but but you've known it all along. But it's not ironic in any sense. But all irony is it's an attempt to unmask something that's been articulated in the primary heroic mode. The hero's really not the hero. So the new Lone Ranger movie that comes out, it turns out that Tonto's really the guy who's moving things along in a good direction, and it turns out that literally unmasking the Lone Ranger, he turns out to be this ridiculous person. So my reaction to something like Shrek, which is completely ironic, it ironizes that all of the fairy tales, that that's fine for an adult, maybe, but to start out with irony with children just gives them this whole attitude that everything needs to be unmasked. It produces revolutionaries, and we have enough revolutionaries right now.
Sure. I like that. So where we're headed in this episode is that before we've talked about Russian literature, this will be about American literature. In the Memoria Press curriculum and the literature sequence that we have at Highlands Island School, we actually make a conscious choice to do more in British literature than we do American literature. However, there are a few important American titles that our students study. There's a year of American literature that our students study. And I think just like with the Russian literature episode, the goal for our education is to equip students to be able to engage intelligently with American literature and to mine its depth and its breadth. So, Kyle, this is something that you and I have talked about kind of informally over the years. I want to start with, do you guys think that there is something essentially American about American books? That those authors that you think of as Americans, what are those characteristics that our students need to have a sense of? This is what it means to be American, and this is what an American book is about.
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, I would say, if I can contribute here, that first of all, I mean, if your three primary story elements, setting, plot, and characterization, you got a different setting.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of difference in how a story is going to go. The whole experience of the West, the conquest of the West, and this sort of thing, I think very much qualifies the kind of stories that are told. I mean, Joseph Epstein has said that he thinks My Antonia is the greatest American novel. And I have some sympathy with that because I just recently read that book. And that is the Western experience. It's the iconic Western experience. Now, an Englishman could not have written that book, right? And so then the question becomes, I mean, the settings are different. I mean, you have Hawthorne, you have Melville, which I think are stories that you could see British writing stories like that, but they're still different. But then you get further on into the later authors like Willa Cather, and you see something even more uniquely American.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't know if this is adding to it, but just along with that, the setting, kind of the first thing that jumped in my head is the woods as being a significant American setting. Hawthorne is, I mean, the woods is where everything happens in Hawthorne, and the wildness of the woods.
William Fenimore Cooper.
Yeah. And I was just going to bring up The Last Mohicans, too, as one of those books that kind of pops into my head as you know, essentially American literature. I get this from my sister, is the one who originally turned me on to that novel. She used to teach it. And yeah, it's a Western. It takes place in the East because that's as far as...
That was the wilderness.
Yeah, right. That was the wilderness.
Was the frontier.
Yeah, but it's still very much about the frontier. And yeah. So with that too, I wonder some sort of, and I'll just, throw this out on the table, some sort of idea of independence as well, entering the woods, on our own. So the expression of independence and then the struggle with independence, I think is... Which is
the struggle of Natty Bumppo, the hero of the leather stocking books,
right?
Of which that's one, Last of the Mohicans.
Right, The Man Without a Cross. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see this in Southern literature too, because Southern literature, like Flannery O'Connor, all of these things are just dripping with Southern images and symbols. And I think somewhere someone has said, I don't know if it was Flannery O'Connor or somebody talking about Flannery O'Connor, but that she, sheds a light on the Christ-haunted South. Mm-hmm. And so there's always something, every time somebody says that I'm from South Carolina, from the South, it's a very evocative image for me, because I was just recently down in Hilton Head and I was seeing all the Spanish moss on the trees, which makes the trees look old, which makes the trees kind of look ghostly, and just that hauntedness of the South, both in its history and the things that have gone on. And that's with slavery, that's with racial relations, that's with even religious relations in the South. I mean, because you've got a lot of Protestants down in the South. There's so much that has haunted the South over the years that shows up in Southern literature.
Yeah.
The heat
and
of Southern literature is
somebody
strong.
has said that the greatest American literature has been regional.
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes.
you have Hawthorne, who's sort of northeastern. Melville, I think you could say that too. Wendell Berry, who's very much a Kentuckian. The whole Port William thing. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings in Florida. If you go around, you will find these great authors. Some of them not widely known, who are Faulkner, another Southern writer. Yeah, the South has produced quite a number of great writers. William Penn Warren, and so forth. So this has been sort of the hallmark of American literature,
Right.
that it's regional, that it's coming from a place, and places even in the United States are different. You get a little bit of that in English literature. The Moors, Scotland is a bit, that sort of thing, and Ireland. You can identify some of those sort of sub-national literatures, but that's even more pronounced in the United States because place plays a greater role, number one, and there's more places.
It's bigger.
It's bigger.
Yeah,
That's
more
right.
places. Yeah.
Do we think though too that, like, I agree with that, but do you think too the struggle with place, or the looking for a place? I'm just interested in this idea of haunting, which is not. It's not a tradition embodied or tangible or firmly held. It's a tradition that haunts, right? And I'm putting that together in my head with two, I kind of use parallel images in American literature, which is from Melville and Faulkner. Moby Dick has a metaphor of passing over the waves and leaving no mark on them, the way a ship doesn't. And then Faulkner picks up that same image in his novella, The Bear, where he talks about moving through the woods, and the woods just kind of close behind you, and it's as though you were not there.
Yes.
Which I think that is very, like, that's the literature of a new nation. That's the anxiety of a new nation. And so that regional quality, I don't know, how do those two fit together?
Well, I mean, in the movement west, I mean, I think with Natty Bumppo, the woods have this mystique to them.
Yeah.
With Faulkner, the woods, the forest itself almost has a spirit
Yes.
that evaporates when the woods are cut down.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of thing, I think, throughout.
And I think it intertwines too with this central idea of freedom. What is freedom, and how do we explore freedom? And I had a professor in college. He said that all American literature comes from Emerson and goes to Emerson. And I don't know if that's true, but it's impacted me because I kind of think of Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau as kind of the spiritual center of American literature in a lot of ways, because they were exploring two things, Walden Pond and self-reliance. And it seems like those two kinds of ideas from Thoreau are behind a lot of American literature. I mean, even Washington Irving, his most famous, the book where the guy sleeps in the wilderness.
Rip Van Winkle.
Yeah. I mean, it's about being free from his his henpecked wife.
Which I think I agree with you in New England, because all the writers you named are New England
True.
writers. But you get to Western literature, and there the impulse is very different. I think with Emerson and Thoreau, they're living in a civilization, so they can dream about not living in a civilization. But you go west, and there is no civilization.
Yeah.
So what you dream of is civilization, and you try to establish it on the frontier.
Yeah, that's good. So let's go around the table like we did when we were talking about novels, and tell me about an American book that you had an experience with, and what you thought about that book that was particularly helpful, and attempt to maybe relate that to its Americanness. So I'm going to give you guys a second to think of one. So whoever has one, throw it out there.
Well, I mean, I recently read My Antonia, but I haven't really processed it yet.
Sure.
But again, you do see these themes of creating home in a what had been a foreign place, and setting down roots, and establishing civilization once again, which is a theme you see all over literature, even very popular literature like Louis L'Amour or something. A lot of his stories are about people founding a town on the prairie when there's still the danger of Indians and all this sort of things. And books, that's why books are very important, you know, and all these Louis L'Amour books, you know, he's always mentioning Plutarch and Blackstone. And that's what people only had a few books, but they were like total classics.
Right.
Even a Western like Owen Wister's The Virginian is about the classical education of a cowboy, because he meets a school teacher who he falls in love with, and she falls in love with him, but she makes him read books, and she'll give him a book, she'll give him a Shakespeare play. He'll bring it back, and he's required to explain it to her. She's civilizing him, and he comes back, and it's some of the funniest renditions of these stories. You know, he comes back to describe King Lear. It's King Lear according to a cowboy. What would that be? But I'd say, you know, it's a little part of the back. But I was very impressed with The Virginian by Owen Wister. I think that's a great American novel.
Yeah.
I almost want to say King Lear as a great American work. It just anticipates.
He doesn't know his geography.
Yeah.
Where's that ocean? No, but so I'll say Moby Dick instead. I feel like people who know me would be disappointed if I didn't say Moby Dick in response to your question. But I can bring King Lear into it because I think they're doing a similar thing. Just that that isolated look at what freedom isn't, I suppose I would say, in both King Lear, who famously tries to exercise his sovereignty, his individual sovereignty over the heavens, over the thunderstorm, and of course fails. And so that places him, you know, you may be a ruler over men, but you are not a ruler over nature. And that placement, I think, is very interesting. It's an interesting question and an interesting assertion from Shakespeare. So I think Melville is picking that up in Moby Dick with Captain Ahab. And I guess a line that I would cite, I forget what chapter it's in, it's towards the end, but it's during a thunderstorm again. So it's his King Lear scene where Ahab is out in the thunderstorm when everyone else is seeking shelter, and he shakes his fist at the heavens and declares that in the presence or before the personified impersonal, a personality stands. And I feel that is so applicable to, in many senses, our contemporary American ideas about rights and freedom, and it's all about asserting your personality. And Melville is anticipating that, and Melville is writing that into his villain. I think as a means of saying this is what liberty is not. And is grappling with that idea of, who are we and what are we when we're out in the wilderness? Right. Yeah. Which being in the wilderness and clinging to books then instead of to your own personality, I think is.
I think they're almost competing narratives.
Yeah.
I recently read Moby Dick, and there's a few things that kind of resonated with me in terms of its Americanness. I mean, you have that New England aspect of it where he's clearly, a genealogical heir to Hawthorne in terms of how he writes, his sense of humor. He's touching on religion even in similar ways. But then also
the Sermon to the Shark.
Yeah,
is the best scene I think I've read anywhere.
Yeah. And on that point, you said that American literature is often regional. A lot of the early American literature too is very like dialect focused. Some of the great early authors were very good at capturing these interesting dialects that came up in different specific regions. And Melville catches that extremely well with the dialect of sea merchant, New England whaler, and that tone of voice.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of the books that I was thinking of to kind of play off this regional aspect again was, and these aren't necessarily my favorite books. One is, but the other is a difficult book that just sat with me for a long time. It's Light in August by William Faulkner, and it's a devastating book. I mean, it is about a biracial figure who doesn't know his parentage, and because of that, doesn't know who he is. And it's difficult for him to interact in society because society also doesn't know. Society doesn't know who he is. And it's a devastating book dealing with the racial history of the past, the racial history of the South, particularly. So it's a Southern novel steeped in that leaves you unsettled by the end.
But isn't it also, I think on the surface, and it is a novel about race.
Yes.
But it seems to me it's universalized.
It is.
In there.
That's right.
We're all people who have forgotten who we are.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so there's that's stuck with me as a piece of American literature that really defines for me what when I go to a Southern book, I often feel a same sense of that kind of despair at times. I mean, you read Flannery O'Connor, and she's operating on the extremes. She's using these extreme figures to really show us who we are, to pull something out of us. And when you get O'Connor, you see that's what she's doing. You know, she's not advocating for a society like this. She's saying this is who we are in all of our ugliness. You know, but then on a more, I guess, beautiful note, Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry. To me, that is. We're in Kentucky, so we can imagine exactly where he is. I love,
especially when he visits Louisville.
That's exactly right. Yeah. We know where he's going, but I love personally driving around Kentucky, driving around Louisville, getting onto these back roads in Henry County or Shelbyville, somewhere like that. And so I see his world when I go out for these kinds of drives. And what I get from something like Jayber Crow, and there's so much that could be said about that, but just that sense of belonging to a place that often when you read maybe some of the Southern literature, there is a sense in which you leave going, do I even want to belong to this place with all the stuff that's going on? In something like Jayber Crow, you see the goodness of being rooted and having family and being a part of the earth in a point.
Yeah, and he uses a lot of reflexive pronouns. He will talk about some person, Maddie or whatever, in herself. Port William in itself. He uses that terminology a lot. To the river in itself. He does that too. Natural things. But there's something about that seems to betray this belief he has that these things themselves have natures.
Yeah.
That even a community
the river
has a nature.
In Jayber
the river
Crow
has a nature. Yes, very much so. That whole discussion of what is the river? Is it the banks of the river that are always there? Is it the water running through the river that the same water is never there? It's always passing through. What is the river?
What does it mean that we're saying American literature is interested? So it's like Wendell Berry in regional place. And it's like Melville, whose whole novel takes place at sea. Yeah. Because there is no solid ground beneath. But what?
But even there, that specific New England sailor takes a unique identity, even compared to the French and German and British whalers that he encounters while they're at sea. And there are other non-New England sailors on the boat, right? And yet there's something I think unique about how Melville is kind of through the voice of Ishmael is thinking about the voyage that Ahab is going under. I think personally that it's tied to this kind of Puritan-dominated New England space that was trying to think about what does it mean to be free now and to grow beyond our Puritan ancestors.
And who came from England, who came to a foreign place. There's always this sense of some kind of alienation from your place, which I think that Berry tries to clothe.
Yes. I was going to say, I think something that we can see in particularly Western literature is the search for home.
Yes.
It's the search for home, and Berry gives us the answer in Port William.
Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Not American.
Right.
But do you see that's the search? To me, I know that it's not an American book, but it's trying to do both. He's going on a quest, and yet they must come home.
Yeah.
And so I think the form that takes in American literature is we go on a quest, we go west or whatever, and we are trying to establish a home in a foreign place. But I do think that in Moby Dick there is, because on a ship you have a bunch of people who've left home.
That's right.
I mean, it's and they yearn for home.
Is that always the case in so do we always start homeless then? Even in Berry?
Well, I think we have Jayber Crow.
He's
Jayber Crow twice.
That's right. And it is the journey home.
Yeah, it's the journey home. His whole
Now,
life. Is
the
a journey
rest
home.
of, you might say in some of his other novels, he's already established Port William
Yeah.
as the central place.
Mm-hmm.
But even there's a sense that those who leave Port William have left home,
Yes.
and that they're now
And they
experiencing.
become less human in
That's
some
right.
ways.
That's
Yeah.
right. They're
Yeah.
no longer who they were.
Yeah.
So let me zag on you guys and say that the author one author I really resonate with, who's an American, is Robert Frost. And Robert Frost was one of the things that resonates with me is that he was 45 when he really was noticed. He had been teaching like PE and English at a small high school, and he was burning himself out. And one of his books of poetry got picked up by some people, and they noticed him. And I think with Frost, you have this unique character that, to compare Frost with like the other notable poets, like John Donne, a famous metaphysical poet from the Middle Ages. You could say that John Donne, his poetry is, if the poem is a frame, he's pointing to things outside the frame: love, theological ideas, God. Later, very like extreme realist poets are going to point at only things in the frame, where it seems like Frost in all of his poems, he's pointing at things in the frame that have resonance all over outside of the frame. And I've used that image before probably, but his book of early poetry, I think it's called North of Boston, just reading that front to back is really awesome. Incredible poems. And I think what makes him such a unique figure is that most people have an impression of him that's very kind of naive and innocent and Thomas Kincaid. And then you step into his poetry and it's so complex. It's very locationally specific, north of Boston. And it's really true to human experience. It resonates. And so I love Frost, and I feel like he embodies a lot of those American characteristics.
Yeah. I've got deep childhood memories of a certain publication of stopping by the woods on a snowy evening with that set of illustrations. It's those pictures. I still have it on the shelf. I read it to my kids, and it made an impact on me as a kid.
And you had mentioned, I think when we were talking about novels earlier on the last episode, the introductions being kind of a form of writing we don't talk about enough. Poetry criticism. Randall Jarrell, his criticism of Frost is really interesting, really good to read. And I think Jarrell's a poet in his own right, but I've only read his criticism of Frost, and it's really interesting. So moving on from our own kind of experiences with American literature, what are those things that you would tell a student or someone who wants to access American literature? Where would you tell them to start? What are some kind of tips that should they be looking for in American literature? Would you recommend starting with Irving and the earliest Americans and moving forward? Is there a way someone could map out what American literature is in their mind to kind of have a sense of it? All of those topics that orient people to this body of literature that we've appreciated anecdotally.
So I've always felt that Irving, while he is so thoroughly American, it's hard for me at least to like put my finger on exactly what that is. If I were to explain it to somebody else, I immediately went to the Scarlet Letter, Cothran, which I think is again the relationship between the community and the woods, and that the conversation that happens in the woods about, can we just run off together? Can we just be free of the constraints of society? That's
and
so.
Don't fall asleep out in the woods.
Yeah. I mean, that's just.
Or don't make a deal with the devil that you meet in the woods. Goodman Brown.
Yeah.
Say also.
It's a good starting spot place for a child's education. I just think it's so, he's criticized, I think it's unfairly, but he gets criticized for being, all his symbolism being so on the nose and so blatantly allegorical, but
that's okay.
Yeah, that's right.
That's okay. Exactly.
And it's good to start with.
That's right.
Because it's easier to understand.
Yeah.
No, I'm the birthmark, Dr. Heidegger's experiment. The symbolism really is very close to the surface, but that doesn't make it any less.
Yeah.
The problem, I think, with a lot of modern literature, American and otherwise, is they bury the symbolism so deep that she's very, very difficult to find.
Sure.
It's intentionally difficult.
Yeah.
It's a puzzle.
And I'm not going to say anything positive yet, like what you should do. I do think we could also, I could say some negative things like what you shouldn't do, and you shouldn't start with Faulkner. I mean, these guys they have very unique styles. Faulkner, even Hemingway in places, Flannery O'Connor for sure. Those you need some time. You need other things beforehand. You need the Scarlet Letter. You need maybe some more of the Western literature, which can be more adventurous and therefore just more interesting and fun to read. You work through that. Working into some of the greats of the giants of Southern literature is probably for a higher level student, and that's okay.
Yeah,
you shouldn't tackle it.
And I think once again, this goes back to the principle that you should read the 1,000 good books before you read the 100 great books.
Yeah, that's right.
That's always the thing, really, to tell people when they aren't familiar with literature and they need to be familiar with literature. And then just start with short stories.
Yeah.
I mean, Hawthorne's short stories. He's a very good short story writer, and he wrote a lot of them. Even Melville, the Lightning Rod Man. Yeah. Of course, most of what we have from Flannery O'Connor, because her career was so short, was short stories. But I agree. Faulkner, O'Connor are doing something very different, and they sort of assume a literary sensibility coming to them that you can't have unless you study some of the other. And we mentioned Steinbeck in the last. Not a big short story writer, but you did write short novels. The Pearl, which is a different setting. And Of Mice and Men, Tortilla Flats, Cannery Row. I think you really get again, he's writing in the West in California. You really get a sense of the older California there, and those kinds of things. And Steinbeck he's using symbolism, but the story, even if you don't really understand the syllogism, the story's still compelling.
So I want to ask you guys this, because I kind of want to start a fight, and that is, even though we aren't literary scholars here, and we haven't read everything except for Ian, he's read everything, but before 1900, who do you guys think is the most important American author before 1900? And maybe let's say who are a few names that would be in contention, and then I want to hear you guys make some bold claims.
Okay, I'll say one that I may justify picking a fight here, particularly with Kyle, because he was talking about James Fenimore Cooper, which I actually brought up in the first place. Yeah. Mark Twain. And of course, Twain writes just an epic takedown of Last of the Mohicans. And, when you read it in terms of his writing ability, his writing style, I have to agree with Twain.
Last of the Mohicans is turgid.
It is turgid to the extreme. And again, now, Twain is an ironist. He's one of the early ironists in American literature. But he's operating at a time when that still is, again, the subordinate mode. And so he writes these great works, among them Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, which have this sense of humor, sort of ironic sense of humor in them, and yet it's not destructive yet. And so I think Twain is.
I think he's
one
definitely in the conversation.
Yeah.
Even I don't even really love Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, but I do love Connecticut Kid and King Arthur's Court, or Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. I just talked about the 90s movie, but the novel and others. I mean, he is one of the best.
So.
How do you feel about Mark Twain?
You did start a fight. Maybe I'm just no fun. But I feel like I've always felt about Mark Twain that he doesn't leave you anything to stand on. If you stand on Mark Twain, he's going to pull the rug out from under you. That's what Mark Twain does, and that's what he loves to do. And he doesn't leave you with anything that you can really.
I think he does it on a small scale, but I don't know. Okay. I mean, you read something like Life on the Mississippi, and it's it's just a description of what that river life was like, and it's so compelling. And he's one also who, when he's describing something, there's a symbolism there. These things mean more than they look like they do on the surface. And so I admit he's subversive in a way, but I think what he's trying to do, I think he's honest, and I think he's trying to subvert these. He's trying to let the wind out of some of these pomposities because they're there, and so I think that the kinds of things he's trying to take down are things that need to be taken down. Such as Cooper.
Not Cooper. No, Cooper. Cooper. He builds a myth. And he comes. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to go that far, perhaps, but he comes as close, perhaps, as possible of giving some sort of mythic quality. There's a myth happening. An epic happening in the woods, on the
art
frontier.
Can be judged
involves us in.
Art can be judged in two ways. Number one, the purpose, and number two, how well the purpose was accomplished. I agree that the purpose is good, but how it is accomplished, I think Twain has some points here.
Okay.
So what are some other names that could be in the conversation? I think Melville, people would generally agree. Moby Dick is one of the greats, and having just read it, I agree. I think it's
fantastic.
Pretty close to
it's
flawless.
hilarious and a story. I mean, it's so symbolic of so many different things. Anybody can read it and have a connection to it.
I think other people would mention maybe Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, although his one novel is very bad and unfinished, but his short stories
or
poems
are very well known.
Yes.
Yeah. What other names would be in the conversation from before the 1900s?
Before 1900.
Before 1900. Sorry, in the 1800s or before.
It's probably some authors in there that have kind of been forgotten about unjustly, and I can't think of who they might be.
Yeah, you can scream at us in the comment section.
Yeah, right.
So turning forward from 1900 on, this is maybe where we get in trouble. But what do you guys think would be? I think Frost to me is the greatest American author. So post 1900, but then there's some modern authors. I mean, he died in the 60s, but Wendell Berry, Marilyn Robinson.
Yeah. Gatsby.
Yeah,
Fitzgerald.
The moment for me when you in the novel, when you see Fitzgerald turning the green light at the end of the dock, when you see him turning that from a romantic symbol to talking about the view of green land across the ocean as the explorers approach this new world. The second he pulls off that switch in meaning, which is actually at the end of the novel, but I mean, I was sold on that novel when I saw that. It's like that is an important American text.
Well, and Gatsby was highly regarded by another American author we have not mentioned here, which is Hemingway. He basically takes care of Fitzgerald in Paris, according to A Movable Feast, who Fitzgerald, who was apparently a hypochondriac, and he drank too much and all kinds of things. He was apparently a mess. But we haven't talked much about Hemingway.
Right.
What do we think of Hemingway?
His greatest work was Fitzgerald.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, he had to work on him a bit. Yeah. So what?
I really don't have all that much exposure to Hemingway. I mean, other than The Old Man and the Sea, which I read probably when I wasn't really paying attention to it. I just kind of picked it up and saw it as I should read that, and I read it, and so I didn't really leave with a sense of profundity in it. But
do you think that Hemingway stands out in that group of early 19th century or 20th century
I think
authors?
he does. I mean, there's definite things to criticize in Hemingway. I read a Hemingway book and I have to go get some adjectives quickly because he doesn't use them. He's got this. Yeah. His writing style there's something admirable about it. Which he learned from Gertrude Stein in Paris. He talks about it. Movable Feast. There's something admirable about it, and it's hard to say what it is, but he wants to state the truth as baldly as he can without adornment. Yeah. And I think that's not a bad. I think it's a noble purpose.
I agree. I read For Whom the Bell Tolls a little while back. And that would be my takeaway. I think ultimately the book doesn't say something true about humanity. So just back to there are two ways to write a novel, what it does and how it does it. I don't agree with what it does, But how he does it, I mean, it's a long book, but it is a remarkably clean, just organized, clean, well-written long book. So he's an impressive writer. For sure.
and he he's been accused of being sort of a nihilist, but I don't know that that's an adequate description of Hemingway. I mean, because there are things, there are truths that he will acquiesce to, but he's trying to just state things as baldly as he can, and so you read something like "Farewell to Arms," and the last lines, his wife's died, his child in childbirth, and the child's died, and he's walking back to the hotel in the rain, and then it's
spoiler alert.
So but I don't take that as him saying the world has no meaning, because he kind of seems like he's saying that sometimes, and yet the way the fact that he's saying it, and this is true with a lot of modernist writers,
right?
Because we're talking about Faulkner, we're talking about Hemingway. These are modernist writers who seem to be wanting to create these narratives that are implying that there is no meaning in the world. But even in something like Old Man and the Sea, which on the surface I think does seem to argue that, but I think if you think about it more deeply, he's really not saying that. There is some meaning even in the meaninglessness. It's like, waiting for Godot. The whole purpose is purposelessness. Well, that's a purpose. I mean, that's his purpose for articulating the play in the first place.
I think that's exactly right. I think Old Man and the Sea, it's easy to end that novel and think, oh, he's saying all of this was useless.
Right.
But reading the novel and thinking of Hemingway writing the novel, you can feel the meaningfulness of everything that the old fisherman does. Yeah. Just in the writing of it. And the way Hemingway handles that.
Yeah.
He senses the meaning, even if I'm sure he does refute it at the end. But
and it's what's interesting to me is that he has some draw to Christianity. Catholicism in particular, because I think that must have been his background. I don't know much about him, but priests are always positive figures and are always treated reverently in his books. So he does. There is some recognition there that there's some spiritual truth that he's not maybe able to capture in his own life. I don't know.
That whole discussion made me think that he would coming back to what is American literature. You could kind of draw a straight line from early American literature, Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving, and the specificity we talked about with the woods and the place. Talking about the place is a major concern of Twain. I mean, of course, it's a major concern for all authors, but there's something very specifically American and forest and agrarian about these authors, and then same for these 20th century authors, and then even the modern authors that kind of stick out to me, Cormac McCarthy or Jayber Crow, or even with these nihilist modern authors, David Foster Wallace, there is still something very specifically regional about the writing today, and that
Larry
kind of
McMurtry.
Larry McMurtry. That's a line that runs all the way back and ties it all together in some ways. And two other authors we haven't mentioned that we should claim both of are W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot. One, an American who wanted to be British, and one, a British person who wanted to be American, and so we'll just claim them both. And two of the greatest 20th century poets.
Oh, you want to comment on those? Eliot's always been sort of a mystery to me because he's writing this poetry. He writes The Wasteland before he becomes a Christian. He writes other things, and he's really a celebrity among the modernists, or the proto-modernists, I'd say. And then he comes. Then he starts writing criticism. He founds the Criterion, the journal, the literary journal. He founds the Criterion. And he comes out, and he is this explicit Christian, critiquing literature from a Christian perspective. And the modernists are going, "Oh my gosh, who is this? This is not who we thought this guy was." And then they can't disown him, which is the beautiful thing about it. And so I love his literary criticism because it's crystal clear. He's a very clear prose writer, whereas poetry, The Wasteland, it's a whole project just to figure out what the darn thing means. So I think, but so personally, I like his criticism.
Sure.
But then he writes the 4 quartets and a few other explicitly Christian poems that are a little bit more understandable.
Sure. On the last, to end, the last question I want to ask you guys is, if you had to choose one American book that you would recommend to someone, what is it? What's the one book that they should read?
So the question was, which one of my children would I hang on to?
Yeah,
That's right.
That's right.
I'm going to go with Jayber Crow for the things that I mentioned before, that it's a story about home and coming home and staying home and being rooted. And that doesn't always mean, one specific place in your life, but there's a whole vision of a flourishing life devoted to your community and your place that Wendell Berry is presenting that is beautiful, that I wish we do more of.
I'm going to zag again and go poetry as well. An author that didn't get brought up, I'd be sad if we didn't talk about. Carl Sandburg, the Chicago poet. He also, and I'm from near Milwaukee. He was a journalist in Milwaukee. Carl Sandburg has a poem called Eating Soup that you should Google and read. I believe it's called Eating Soup. Yeah.
I've seen the sign for his birthplace in North Carolina.
Yeah, there's a Carl Sandburg house.
Yeah, Carl Sandburg house.
Oh, we could stall for a little bit more time, and I'd be able to decide.
I would think it would be obvious what you'd say.
Really? What do you think I would say?
Moby Dick.
Moby Dick.
Yeah, okay. Because I'm torn between Gatsby, though. I want to say Gatsby.
All right.
I think I might go ahead and say Gatsby. It's so beautiful.
I mentioned this
and
earlier.
so
the final line in Gatsby is one of the best final lines in all of literature. I mean, just go read it. I'm not going to say it. You need to read it.
Will the movie suffice, or do you have to?
No.
I'm just kidding. I've read the book.
Yeah, no, the movie will not suffice. No, 1,000 times no. It's the book. It's the sentences, the word structure. I'm sorry, Melville, but his novel's just not as well put. It's more put together than people think.
Right.
But it's not as well put together as it could have been. And I can't say that about The Great Gatsby. I think Great Gatsby is perfectly wrought.
I'm gonna say a book by an author we have not discussed, and part of the problem is she only wrote one book. To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah.
I think is the most finely crafted, the most compelling in its story, it's convincing in its setting, and its characters are, Atticus, and Scout and Jem. I can just see that little community in Alabama, and there's something utterly American,
right?
Although there is another book, and I
appreciate that you said that she has one book, and we agree.
Yeah.
That's correct.
I'll tell you another book that was thought to be. It's very politically incorrect now. It was thought to be the great American novel before this, and that was the movie, Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh.
Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind. It's Gone with the Wind. I read that. Cheryl promised, I had to promise her that I would read that book. And I did. And it's not a racist book if you actually read it. And it's an incredible book. And it's strange because Scarlett O'Hara is not the heroine of the book. All the things they say about it, it's clearly by people who have not read the book. There's a very much a critique of slavery in there. There's very much all this stuff. So I just hate that book has fallen into such disrepute because it doesn't deserve this.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Classical Etc. If you'd like to show your support for the show, then you can leave a like below. If you'd like to add your voice to the conversation, then you can comment. And if you want to follow along with us on this journey, then please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.